This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Mariam Namazi. You're watching the NewsHour live from London. Coming up, a search and rescue operation continues into the night after a powerful earthquake levels dozens of buildings in Turkey's Izmir province. Vigils are held across France for 3 people killed in Nice, among them a mother of 3 who cared for the elderly. This during a national coronavirus lockdown in France. Cases are also surging in Italy and Germany. The EU says a joined-up response is the only remedy. And the state of Texas breaks early voting records. More people have voted before this election than the entire vote in 2016. There's a desperate search for survivors in the Turkish city of Izmir after it was struck by a powerful earthquake under the Aegean Sea. The magnitude 7 tremor brought down buildings and triggered tidal waves in the coastal city as well as in parts of Greece. At least 20 buildings have collapsed and several neighborhoods were flooded by seawater. 19 people are now known to have died. That includes 2 teenagers on the Greek island of Samos, though the death toll number is expected to rise. More than 700 others were injured, though search and rescue teams are still working through the rubble. Sinem Kasioglu reports now from Istanbul.
Rescuers search for survivors in the rubble of buildings in Izmir, Turkey's 3rd biggest city. The epicenter of Friday afternoon's shallow, magnitude 7 earthquake was off the Turkish coast.
I have a shop on the back side. I was talking with someone and I felt it while we were outside. The ground started to shake. While I was watching our building, I saw this one collapse.
Many buildings collapsed, injuring hundreds.
Allah'ım sen bizi kazadan beladan uzak tut ya Rabbim.
This man says, God, you're the greatest. Please protect us. It still continues. Emergency responders are traveling from Istanbul to support rescue efforts, while residents are asked not to jam phone lines or transport links unnecessarily.
I thought that the ground had shattered. You cannot think. All you try to do is get out. Everywhere was collapsing. Luckily, our building was intact. We were really panicked and managed to get out at the last minute.
Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was quick to respond to the earthquake.
Sözlerime başlamadan önce
I would like to express my sympathies to the city that were exposed to the earthquake that occurred around Izmir. I would like to express condolences for those who lost their lives under the buildings that collapsed in the earthquake, and I wish speedy recovery for the injured.
The quake caused damage in many provinces in western Turkey and triggered a sea surge that flooded streets near the city of Izmir. Some damage was also reported to buildings and roads on the Greek island of Samos. A hospital director there said some people with light injuries have been treated.
We are hoping that the numbers will not be escalating, and we hope to hear the news about more people being rescued, but the fact that some 20 buildings have collapsed is a big news, and I'm afraid the number of casualties may rise.
Crisscrossed by major fault lines, Turkey is one of the world's most earthquake-prone countries. At least 17,000 people were killed in 1999 when a large quake struck the city of Izmit, southeast of Istanbul. And around 500 Turks died in the earthquake, which struck the eastern city of Van 9 years ago.
For this earthquake, about 6,000 people live in the area of severe shaking, 71,000 in the area of very strong shaking, and 3.2 million in the area of strong shaking, which implies that, in fact, the number of casualties is likely to rise, possibly substantially. The one thing is that Turkey, since 1999, has evolved a pretty good network of search and rescue units.
The earthquake was also felt here in Istanbul, 500 kilometers far from Izmir. Now, residents in Turkey and on nearby Greek islands have been warned of aftershocks and further damage they might bring. Sinem Kasioglu, Al Jazeera, Istanbul.
Well, this is the scene now where rescue workers are continuing to work through the night. As you can see, through the rubble of those collapsed buildings following the earthquake. And this is very much a race against time to try and find who they can, because of course as time goes on, the likelihood becomes less that people would be found safe and well. But currently 19 people are known to have died, 700 others injured, and that's the scene at the moment in Izmir. Well, we can now speak to Elif Ishik. She is the country communications officer for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, and was in Izmir when the quake hit. So let me ask you where specifically you were when the earthquake hit, and if you could describe what it felt like.
Actually, I was at home with my family, and it was a very big earthquake. I experienced some earthquakes in my life before as a person living in Turkey, naturally, but I can say this was the biggest earthquake that I've ever seen, and we couldn't go out until it ended, and it lasted almost for 30 seconds, I can say, and we waited for it to end, and then we could go out. And when we went out, everyone was crying, everyone was very shocked, and they were trying to reach out to their loved ones. The atmosphere was very chaotic.
And we're just looking at some pictures from Izmir now, just complete rubble at the scene of those collapsed buildings, twisted bits of metal, chunks of concrete everywhere. I mean, I don't know, what can you tell us about the scale of destruction there? What have you been seeing?
We see such destruction in specific neighborhoods, but more than 15 buildings have collapsed like this, and injured people, the number of injured people are increasing hour by hour. So I can say, I think it looks like it will rise, unfortunately.
What can you tell us about who was living in these buildings? These were mainly residential buildings?
They're apartments, yeah. Families are living there. They're neighborhoods with people, not like industrial places or not business centers. They're mostly from the neighborhoods that people are actually living there.
And obviously we have the official figures that 19 people are known to have died, but really when you look at these scenes of carnage, it is likely that it's going to rise perhaps quite a bit. Are you hearing anything from family, friends, neighbors about the casualties?
The search and rescue teams are still trying to find people, and the first 24 hours is very important to find people, because as the hours passes, then it will be hard to find maybe alive people there. So we're still waiting for good news, I can say. And Turkish Red Crescent emergency teams have been deployed very quickly, and they now provide food and basic need support to the rescue workers and affected people there, as well as providing psychological support to affected population there. And we, as IFRC, also supporting Turkish Red Crescent with their information management and emergency coordination. We hope this will end. And I also want to add that today I heard people saying to each other, when 2020 will end. People are very overwhelmed by the burden.
Well, so can I actually ask you about that? Because if the death toll rises, but also it's about the number of hundreds of people have been injured, and there will be varying degrees of injury. But of course, all this at a time of the COVID-19 pandemic, that's going to complicate the situation.
Exactly. When I went out today after the earthquake, after I got rid of the first shock, I realized that no one was caring about the precautions because they were shocked and they didn't have masks. They left their apartment suddenly. This will put another burden on our rescue workers because we have a pandemic going on. They have to think about that as well. But this emergency situation creates another chaos. So I think it's very hard at the moment.
Thank you very much for joining us, Elif Ishik, Country Communications Officer for the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. You're watching the NewsHour live from London. Much more still ahead for you on the programme. Defying coronavirus restrictions, thousands converge on the Polish capital to voice their anger against tough new abortion laws. The fighting intensifies in Nagorno-Karabakh. Hopes now turn to internationally mediated talks between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And some of the best surfers in the world couldn't tame these colossal waves off the coast of Portugal. Farah will have that story and much more in the sport. Well, vigils have been held across France in honour of the 3 people killed in an attack on a church in Nice. The suspect is now in custody. Investigators say he's from Tunisia and arrived in Europe last month on the island of Lampedusa. A makeshift memorial has been set up outside the Notre Dame Basilica in Nice, from where David Chater reports.
Outside the Basilica in Nice, streams of people are still coming to pay respect to those who lost their lives and pray grieving loved ones. A sense of shock and dismay here that terrorism has once again blighted their city.
Everything must come to an end one day. You have to have faith. Faith brings happiness, not war.
Political attitudes of the crisis are hardening. The French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin said his country was at war against an Islamist ideology, not against a religion, and faced both internal and external enemies. Words that concern the Muslim community here.
Muslims have now to express themselves and media have to give them audience. They are ready to tell that we are keeping strong, facing this fear of terrorism. Terrorism won't win.
The chief anti-terrorist prosecutor revealed the attacker was a refugee from Tunisia. Sources have named him as Ibrahim Wissawi, who's 21. He reached the Italian island of Lampedusa last month before coming to France when his request for asylum was refused.
Je crois que dans cette guerre contre l'islamisme, puisqu'on parle de guerre,
in this war against Islamism, because we do now speak about war, and because war has been declared, it is necessary to win the fight. Because I think the people of France want protection. They want us to change the method. I think it's time to promote constitutional reform, to create a French Guantanamo for those we know as dangerous people.
Here in Nice, police have arrested a 47-year-old man who's been accused of providing the knife man with a mobile phone. The knife man himself is now in hospital being treated for serious bullet wounds, surrounded by the police. On the eve of All Saints' Day, the congregation are determined to continue with their services despite the horror witnessed here. Their prayers will be to victims and their grieving families. Vincent Loquez, the father of 2 daughters aged 21 and 25, who worked as a warden at the church for 7 years. Simone Barreto Silva, a Brazilian mother of 3 who has been in France for 30 years and worked in the care service for the elderly. And a woman aged around 70 years, almost beheaded as she knelt in prayer. Nobody yet knows her name. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Nice.
Well, in other developments, there have been large protests in several Muslim nations against the French President Emmanuel Macron. He's declared war on what he described as Islamist separatism, which he says is taking over some communities in France. Mohammed Jamjoom has more.
For a growing number of Muslims, the anger over French President Emmanuel Macron's comments on Islam is only intensifying. In Pakistan's capital, Islamabad, the situation grew tense as protesters gathered close to the French embassy, demonstrating against Macron's recent comments about the publication of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, as they burned effigies and stomped on photographs of him, all the while demanding the expulsion of the French ambassador to Pakistan.
A Muslim can sacrifice his life, but will not let anyone insult the Prophet.
Pakistan isn't the only country where demonstrators came out. After protests were called for by Islamic organizations in Bangladesh, thousands converged in Dhaka, the country's capital. Outraged about Macron's defense of the right to mock religion after the murder of a school teacher in France last week. One of the placards on display was a direct response, reading, "Freedom of speech is not freedom to abuse." Demonstrations too in several Indian cities, where protesters condemned Macron's statements, saying they were offensive to Islam and Muslims. In the Sudanese capital Khartoum, demonstrators renewed their demand for a boycott of French products. Sentiments echoed in the Gaza Strip, where Hamas organized a protest after Friday prayers. All of these gatherings signifying not just the depth of the anger over Macron's comments, but also how that anger may not subside anytime soon. Mohammed Jamjoom, Al Jazeera.
Well, EU officials have warned members to prepare for new coronavirus restrictions as infections surge across the continent. The bloc is planning a coordinated response to make sure hospitals aren't overwhelmed. But its health commissioner says further measures need to be imposed to break the chain of transmission. Millions of people across France are once again under lockdown, and Germany is set to follow suit next week. Natasha Butler reports now from Paris.
Quiet neighbourhoods and closed cafes in Paris as France begins a new lockdown. The picturesque area of Montmartre nearly empty. The French government says the measure will help stop the coronavirus spread, but for some, staying home a second time won't be easy.
I don't think lockdown is the best idea because it only delays things. So in the short term, things may get better, but once the lockdown is lifted, it will be the same as before and cases will rise again.
We expected it. It seems necessary. They tried a curfew, but it didn't work. So now the most important thing is for everyone to play the game, to respect it, so we can live normally again.
There was some traffic in the city centre. The government's allowed some businesses and public services to remain open to help buoy the struggling economy. But office buildings in the financial district were shut. Well, in the centre of Paris's business district, there are a few people out and about, but it's nowhere near as busy as it would be normally on a regular day. Tens of thousands of people work in this area, and the square behind me would usually be teeming with activity. A second wave is battering economies and people's health across Europe. In Russia, new infections are rising fast. Some doctors say medical supplies are running out. In Germany, some hospitals may not have enough staff to cope with the emergency.
The number of patients has risen in the past few days. In the past week, we've had twice, even 3 times more patients than before. We still have capacity to provide good care, but we are seeing a fall in care supply. Our staff is slowly reaching their limit.
The European Union says the bloc must act fast not to be overwhelmed. Leaders have agreed to pay for the transfer of patients across borders. In a virtual meeting, EU health ministers promised to better coordinate their approach.
We're not powerless in the face of it. After all, there are hygiene measures and we can wear masks, but we need to coordinate measures with other member states, and that came across very clearly. But it's important that people take charge of their own responsibilities on a daily basis.
The French government had wanted to avoid a second shutdown at all costs, ruling out such a measure until very recently. But the spiralling infection rate made them change their strategy. Germany will also lock down. The urgency of the situation suggests other European countries may be forced to follow suit. Natasha Butler, Al Jazeera, Paris.
Four days to go now until the US presidential election, and Texas has seen an unprecedented surge in early voting. The number of people who've chosen to submit in-person or mail-in ballots has already eclipsed the state's total turnout for 2016. More than 9 million Texans have cast early votes. That makes Texas just the second state after Hawaii to break its voting record before Election Day. The southern state is America's second largest electoral prize after California. It hasn't voted for a Democrat since Jimmy Carter in 1976. But polls are now suggesting Joe Biden is ahead with early voters there. And, Donald Trump, he did win Texas by a 9-point margin 4 years ago. That's around 800,000 votes. His campaign says its own analysis shows the president is well ahead. Well, Shihab Rutansi joins us now from Washington. And Shihab, early voting is a key part of the story of this election, but the focus remains on the battleground in the Midwest.
Right, and 24 hours ago we were talking about Florida, where the polls are very, very close. If Trump loses Florida, then he has to have a sweep in the Midwest. If Biden loses Florida, there's still various routes to winning a majority in the Electoral College. And it's been fascinating today to watch Donald Trump in the Midwest campaign there, because once again, as he did in 2016, when he's in the Midwest, he sounds like Bernie Sanders. He sounds like a socialist. He's talking about outsourcing, about workers' rights, about the trade deals like NAFTA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's talking about protecting Social Security and Medicare. And this worked in 2016 because by that point many workers, many union workers had come to the conclusion that Barack Obama had been totally owned by Wall Street and corporate interest. Obama had campaigned on renegotiating NAFTA. He didn't. He just signed the U.S. up to another trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which many had concluded would continue the outsourcing. Donald Trump did renegotiate NAFTA. And you can't underestimate how important that achievement is for many workers. It was warmly welcomed by trade unions here in the U.S. So he does that. He has that on his side. He also has Joe Biden on his side in the sense that throughout Obama's legacy on these sorts of issues, Biden was by his side. Biden long been thought of as a corporate Democrat. He used to be known as the senator from MBNA, a credit card company in Delaware, so closely entwined is he with Wall Street financial interests. He has long talked about cutting Social Security and Medicare. And there's still that suspicion, not just amongst workers in the Midwest, but around the country, as to which Biden it would be in the White House if he does win on Tuesday, because he's saying very progressive things now, but he has many of the same old advisors. So Trump is able to play on that. The problem is we now have had 4 years of Donald Trump, and he hasn't stopped the outsourcing. He hasn't stopped the decline of manufacturing. Things are largely in line with long-term trends, so workers are aware of that. And they also know that Trump continues to downplay COVID, which is an economic issue as well as a health issue. And that's another, it's not necessarily playing well for Trump to be downplaying it when workers are feeling the layoffs and the furloughs. So it's an interesting dilemma for workers in the Midwest.
What is President Trump's strategy at this late stage of the game?
The strategy has always been relying on several factors. First of all, that there are going to be a load of people voting in this election who didn't vote in 2016. And we are seeing a surge in voter registration amongst white male voters without a college degree. That's the Trump campaign hopes is going to be their base. It's also the Trump campaign is hoping that many people, the pollsters simply aren't picking up those sorts of voters who aren't even on their radar. There's also the phenomenon of the shy Trump voter, those who tell the pollsters that they'll vote for Biden but secretly will actually vote for Trump. And there are now techniques that some pollsters are using to try and figure out to what extent that is true. So they'll ask initially, well, who are you going to vote for? And they'll find then Biden will have a 10-point lead. But if they ask, well, who are people in your social circle going to vote for, your friends and relatives? And then you see that lead narrow. Then Biden has a 4 or 5 point lead. So there's that sense that there are a lot of hidden Trump voters. You're just talking about Texas, for example. It's interesting. Democrats are very hopeful that these are going to be new voters who are in the suburbs of big cities, Houston and so on, Hispanic voters who will be now registering to vote because they're so disgusted by Trump. But the Trump campaign is hoping that a lot of these newly registered voters are exactly the sort of voters that I was just talking about, people who didn't vote in 2016 but now want to get Trump into office. So that's what they're hoping for.
Thanks very much. With the latest from Washington, Shihab Rutansi. Thank you, Shihab. Well, as tens of millions of US voters cast their ballots early, former criminals are struggling to get their voices heard. In Florida, ex-inmates are allowed to vote, but only if they've paid their court fines and fees, which many of them can't afford to do. The state is a key battleground this November, as Shahab was just saying there, and its Republican governor has been accused of trying to suppress more than 1 million votes. Annie Gallagher reports now from Miami.
This is a big day for Tarshay Sanderson.
Yes, we highly recommend her. I highly recommend her too.
The former felon's voting rights were restored 2 years ago. Then Florida's Republican governor approved legislation blocking ex-criminals from voting until they paid outstanding fines and fees. Ron DeSantis said it's about making former felons repay all their debts to society, while opponents see it as taking away their rights. After getting advice from a civil rights group, Tarshay was assured her voice is one that can be heard.
Everything is a struggle for everything. If you want to succeed, you have to go through something. And in order to get through it, you have to get to it, you have to go through it. So I went through and I'm on the other side of it. And as you see, I voted today and I'm ecstatic.
The campaign to restore the voting rights of so-called returning citizens has garnered national attention. In other states like Illinois, those serving sentences are allowed to cast a ballot. But the picture in Florida is far more complex.
And I'm clicking through a bunch of different case numbers with confusing notations as to what they mean.
Lawyers say it's a form of voter suppression that targets the poor and minorities.
There's no one-stop shop for getting an answer. It is completely, piecing together a puzzle. And quite frankly, it's difficult for a team of lawyers to do it. And your average person living in Florida isn't going to be able to do it.
Voter suppression is nothing new in this country. It's been going on in one form or another for decades. But critics say this is a particularly insidious form of it. Even if former felons manage to wade their way through all the red tape, many fear that by exercising their democratic right, they could be committing another crime. For ex-felons, registering to vote without paying legal fees could get them in trouble. And with the system so convoluted, many just don't take the chance.
They're the role models of their communities.
Former felon Angel Sanchez works for the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, which helps people like him navigate the complex process of getting their vote back. He says those who do vote are heroes. That's a real act of bravery.
That's why we would commend every single returning citizen who turns out and vote for their civic engagement and courage, because even if there wasn't a fear here, there's been a history of saying your vote doesn't matter, your vote doesn't count. Learn to live with that.
According to civil rights groups, the legislation here potentially leaves many ex-felons without a vote.
I voted!
For those that fight, the simple act of voting isn't something they take for granted. Andy Gallagher, Al Jazeera, Miami, Florida.
And in part 3 of our series, Unheard Americans, our New York correspondent this time, Gabriel Elizondo, speaks to immigrants in one of the most ethnically diverse communities in the US. We'll hear how some feel about voting for the first time. That's on Saturday here on Al Jazeera. Now to Mexico. The remains of young women are among 59 bodies found in a hidden grave in the central part of the country. This is the latest discovery as police and security forces struggle to contain violence that's led to a record number of murders, many of them linked to drug gangs. Katia Lopez-Hodayan reports.
More teams are called in to look for more bodies. The remains of dozens of people have already been discovered here, dumped in mass graves in Mexico's central state of Guanajuato. Many were women, and most were teenagers.
Hemos contemplado regresar, ya que es un territorio.
It's a very wide area. We must continue the search because we think there may be more remains buried there.
This mother fears her son could be a victim of the drug cartels in their battles for control of the cocaine trade and other illegal narcotics. At first, she believed he was still alive, but that hope is now dwindling.
I hope they let me go into the area to see for myself. I can maybe recognize something, like my son's clothes. That's what I'm hoping for.
More than 3,000 unmarked graves have been found since Mexico's military was deployed to fight the powerful drug cartels in 2006. For years, families have appealed for more government help to find their missing relatives.
50 cuerpos de fosas clandestinas
Critics say the lenient approach of President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has emboldened the drug gangs. Turf wars between rivals has led to more murders, and an estimated 40,000 Mexicans are reported missing. And now public frustration is growing.
It makes us sad because our beloved city is always quiet. We go out, not very late, but with our family. We can't do that anymore because of the insecurity.
Back at the mass grave, families say all they can do now is wait for answers on who is buried here, and perhaps hope for some closure. Katia Lopez-Odoyan, Al Jazeera.
Much more still ahead on this NewsHour from London. As Armenia and Azerbaijan trade shells over the border in Georgia, the conflict is causing a war of words in an election campaign. And the Portland Timbers have booked their place in the playoffs, and they did it in style. We'll have all the football action coming up later on.
Hello, it's been fine and sunny across the good part of southern Europe, certainly down towards Spain and Portugal. Lovely big dome of clear skies here, high pressure in charge, keeping things nice and settled. But around our high, we've seen bands of cloud and rain just getting pushed in from the Atlantic, some very wet and windy weather across the British Isles. We have seen flooding in the northwest of England, further spells of very wet weather coming in here as we go on through Saturday, a blustery old day as well. That cloud and rain will make its way across the North Sea. Notice some lively showers too around Romania, Ukraine, pushing across the Black Sea, pushing up into that western side of Russia. As we go on through Sunday, still some showers around here, clearer skies for central and southern parts, but wet weather will push towards the Bay of Biscay, so northern parts of Spain and Portugal can expect to see some wet weather. The really wet weather will be through the Brest Peninsula, pushing back across Ireland, Northern Ireland, western parts of England, along with Wales and a good part of Scotland. So some more lively weather coming through here. Best of the sunshine then is across the Mediterranean. But that said, other side of the Med, we'll see a few showers just fed into that northeastern corner of Libya. Some wetter weather too, a possibility for northern Egypt.
Welcome back. You're watching the NewsHour. Our top stories. Search and rescue operations are continuing into the night in the Turkish city of Izmir after it was struck by a powerful earthquake. 20 buildings collapsed and several neighborhoods in the coastal city were flooded by seawater. At least 19 people were killed. That figure includes 2 teenagers in Greece. Vigils have been held in memory of the 3 people killed in Thursday's knife attack in southern France. Security has been tightened with more soldiers deployed across the country after the attack in Nice. And with 4 days still to go before the US presidential election, more people have voted early in Texas than the entire number that voted in 2016. It's been Republican for more than 40 years, but polls suggest a shock Democrat gain could possibly be on the cards. Now, thousands of protesters are gathering in the Polish capital Warsaw to rally against a near-total ban on abortions. Defying rules that restrict gatherings during the coronavirus pandemic, activists are marching through the city. Military police have lined the streets, some of them in riot gear. There's been more than a week of protests now against a court ruling which further restricted the country's abortion laws. The procedure is now only available in cases of rape, incest, or where the mother's health is at risk. So for more on this, let's speak to Wojtek Przybylski. He is the editor-in-chief of the Visegrad Insight, joins us live now from Warsaw via Skype. We were just seeing pictures of the protests there. Really, the numbers of people out continues to be quite strong. How would you describe the strength of these protests?
Well, these are definitely one of the biggest protests since 1989. And the biggest protests during the course of this government, of PIS government.
Is it likely to continue, particularly in light of coronavirus restrictions? Are there concerns about the spread of the virus accelerating because of these demonstrations?
Well, as we have been reading multiple reports by medical researchers, there is no correlation between open-air protests and the spread of the virus. Most of this research has been carried out in relationship to Belarus, where you see thousands marching through the streets and no increase of the coronavirus. So there is no relationship to that.
What's likely to happen in the wake of this court ruling, the restrictions on abortions? What are we seeing in the country in terms of hospitals and clinics? How are they responding to the court ruling?
Currently, the scheduled abortions are on hold, or they are maybe not on. There is a lot of uncertainty that is touching both women and the doctors about the procedure and the consequences, the legal consequences of that act. The government should be publishing the court decision to make it into law, but is delaying this despite it should publish it immediately. The uncertainty around this situation creates even more disturbance and even more anger, public outrage at how government is manipulating with this delicate and very sensitive issue in the times of pandemic.
And I suppose many women, those in need of those that want to get abortions that are now unable to make that decision, I suppose we'll see more women travelling abroad to access abortions as a result of this.
Well, here's the thing. During pandemic, we don't know how long it will still last, and increasing chance that there will be more and more lockdowns around Europe. That sort of a window for those who would like to carry out the procedure outside of the borders of Poland will be even more at risk. The hospitals are overburdened everywhere, not only in Poland.
Is there also some concern then that it could lead to more illegal abortions inside the country if women aren't able to travel very easily?
Well, naturally, that decision of the Constitutional Court may increase that risk, and in the longer run, if there is no change, that will definitely increase the illegal abortion.
Oh, well, thank you very much for giving us a sense of the atmosphere there in the country as those protests continue in Warsaw. Wojtek Biszybilski from the Visegrad Insight Group. Thank you. Well, now, after talks with mediators in Geneva, Armenia and Azerbaijan have agreed to not deliberately target civilian populations, but they appear to have failed to end their conflict. It comes as both sides make advances towards key locations in their battle for control of the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region. Armenian officials say their troops have blown up ammunition close to Azeri troops near the city of Stepanakert. Not far away, Azerbaijan's army is said to be closing in on the key town of Shushi. Fighting in the region has intensified in recent days. Well, Rory Challens is in the Armenian capital, Yerevan. He says there is concern there about the Azeri advance.
Well, certainly these are difficult days for Armenia. Nobody here would have thought just a month ago that within a few weeks Azerbaijani forces would have been knocking on the door of Shushi itself. It's a big blow, I think, for the Armenians. What they are saying at the moment, though, is that this first attack by the Azerbaijani forces has been pushed back. They are saying as well that this is going to be a very difficult place for the Azerbaijani forces to take. It's essentially a kind of mountain citadel. It's on a rocky outcrop, and getting up those steep sides to the city itself is going to be very, very difficult. The Armenians are saying that, yes, things have been bad before in the 1990s wars, that things were looking very grim there for their forces, but they managed to turn it around and eventually prevailed. They are hoping that in President Aliyev of Azerbaijan's promise to his people that he will take back the entirety of Nagorno-Karabakh and the surrounding areas for Azerbaijan, that he's essentially over-promised, and that this is leading him to rush a military assault, leaving Azerbaijani troops overstretched and overexposed and therefore vulnerable to counterattacks. But they know, the Armenians, that they have lost significant territory in recent days and weeks.
Well, Armenia and Azerbaijan's nearest neighbour is feeling the effects of this conflict, and it's looming large as Georgians prepare to elect a new parliament on Saturday. Azeri and Armenian minorities make up 10% of the population, enough to potentially influence the outcome. But as Robin Forestier-Walker reports from Marneuli, near the border of all three countries, there are dangers in using ethnicity.
Marneuli municipality is a patchwork of ethnic diversity on Georgia's border with Armenia and Azerbaijan. Here, ethnic Georgian, Azeri and Armenian voters must choose who will best represent their interests in Saturday's parliamentary election.
Historically, the people of Marneuli have tended to vote collectively, and that's why it's tempting for politicians to find an issue that resonates with the community as a whole. And at the moment, the one issue on everyone's mind is the war across the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Siteli is an Armenian village. Vegetable farmer Karen says he'll vote for the government.
Inside every ethnic group there is pain in our hearts because war brings nothing good. Civilians are dying there. Here we are friends. I have Azeri neighbours and Georgian neighbours, and we have brotherly relations.
Officially, the Georgian government has taken a neutral position on the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, mindful that it could inflame tensions between its minority communities. But Georgia's largest opposition party, the United National Movement, has taken sides. Its leadership says that Karabakh belongs to Azerbaijan. It hopes to win votes in places like Marneuli. 80% of the population identify as ethnic Azeris. At the local radio station, the DJs know how important that is for Azeri listeners.
It was pleasing for Azeris to hear it, and for some it will be a decisive factor. Today people expect you to have a position. You can't have neutrality.
Back in the village of Siteli, youth leader Aram says he doesn't like politicians who play with ethnicity.
I've never considered myself a minority. On the contrary, I'm a citizen of Georgia, pure and simple.
And his team, ironically, is sponsored by the state oil company of Azerbaijan.
The village needs development, roads, paving, arranging a stadium and more. And in my opinion, this is the principle for which people should go to the polls.
Marneuli is a political battleground, but unlike across the border, at least all Georgian citizens here have a chance to vote in peace. Robin Forestier-Walker, Al Jazeera, Marneuli.
Still ahead for you on the programme. It's been a long 7 months without goals for Argentina's football fans, but the beautiful game is back. All voters are heading to the polls in Ivory Coast on Saturday to choose between President Alassane Ouattara and his independent rival, Kouadio Konan Bertin. But the opposition has vowed to disrupt the vote, raising fears of civil unrest, while for many people there's also a sense of complacency. Ahmed Idris has our report.
Unclaimed voters' cards at a collection centre in Abidjan. The Election Commission says voters have claimed less than 42% of the cards. Some say that illustrates how many people in Ivory Coast feel about the presidential election.
I will not vote under the current circumstances because you can only go where your safety is assured. I don't see such conditions in place. I'd rather stay home.
In the run-up to the vote, dozens of people have been killed amid escalating political tensions. That in a country still recovering after months of pre-election violence in 2010 and 2011 that left about 3,000 people dead. Incumbent President Alassane Ouattara is running for a third time against an independent after two other candidates boycotted the election and called on supporters to disrupt the polls.
For me, I find this election a bit strange. Every party started to campaign well, then we hear of a boycott. It's so confusing. I think we should proceed with the vote to avoid a repeat of 2010. But I can tell you everyone is scared. People haven't forgotten 2010.
The literacy rate here is 47%, an area many voters will want to see improved. With an average of 7% annual growth, Ivory Coast's economy is doing well and better than much of Africa. But many of its young people say they feel left behind. For some, ready to cast their ballot, they expect much from the next president.
I would like the next president to be a leader for the whole country, a man who will develop the country, someone who will improve healthcare delivery and security. He should also improve education because of the high level of illiteracy. Importantly, he should provide jobs for the youths.
Meeting these expectations won't be easy for a country whose revenues are tied to fluctuating commodity prices. In addition, people here will want to see whoever wins this election tackle the difficult task of reuniting a deeply divided country. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera.
Well, news of another election, this time in Tanzania. Now, the Electoral Commission there is saying that President John Magufuli has won a second term in office, but opposition groups have dismissed these results over claims of widespread irregularities. According to the national count, Magufuli won at 12.5 million votes in Wednesday's election, while his main challenger got just 1.9 million. Magufuli has vowed to boost the economy by completing ambitious infrastructure projects he started in his first term. Well, in other stories we're following, 2 men have been sentenced to 33 and 18 years in prison for their role in the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya. They were convicted earlier this month for helping al-Shabaab fighters storm the Nairobi shopping centre in 2013. 67 people were killed during a siege that lasted for 4 days. Now, hundreds of villagers have attended the funerals of 3 Indian politicians who were shot and killed in Indian-administered Kashmir. They were members of India's ruling Nationalist Party, which revoked the area's autonomy last year. Elizabeth Puranam has more on this now from New Delhi.
There were large crowds at the funerals of the 3 members of the Bharatiya Janata Party in the district of Kulgam in Indian-administered Kashmir. Kashmir's Inspector General has visited the site of the shooting, which has been cordoned off while police officers search for members of Lashkar-e-Taiba. That's an armed group with links to Pakistan, which both the Indian and the US government hold responsible for the attacks in Mumbai in 2008, which left at least 150 people dead. Now, around 10 BJP workers have been killed in Indian-administered Kashmir this year. It has been a particularly violent past year since the BJP government revoked the region's autonomy in August 2019 with an increase in security operations. Security forces have killed around 200 rebels in some 85 operations this year. Now, these deaths follow anti-terrorism raids which have been taking place across the country this week, most of them in Indian-administered Kashmir, but also here in the capital, Delhi, with the National Investigation Agency raiding around 20 offices of charities, newspapers, human rights activists, accusing them of using money that's been raised for charitable work, funneling it into what they call separatist and secessionist activities in Indian-administered Kashmir. Now, Kashmiri politicians have condemned the raids as a vicious crackdown on dissent. People were detained on Thursday for protesting against those raids, and the unrest is set to continue, with separatist leaders in Kashmir calling for a shutdown on Saturday to protest against new land laws which have now come into force, which for the first time allow non-Kashmiris to buy land in the region, with many Kashmiris, including the separatists, accusing the government of trying to change the demographics of the region.
Time for all the sport now with Farah.
Thanks very much. Paris Saint-Germain president Nasser Al-Khelaifi has been cleared of a corruption charge at a court in Switzerland. He'd been accused of inciting a former FIFA official to commit aggravated criminal mismanagement. It was in relation to securing World Cup TV rights for the Qatari network beIN Sports, of which Al-Khelaifi is the chairman. In a statement, he said, "After a relentless 4-year campaign against me that ignored the basic facts and the law at every turn, I have finally fully and completely cleared my name. Today's verdict is a total vindication." Now, professional football is finally back in Argentina after a 7-month hiatus. Because of COVID-19 restrictions, players will face off without fans and with tight protocols in place. But the passion and magic of Maradona will finally be under stadium lights again. Daniel Schweimer reports.
The Argentine League is one of the last in the world to resume playing football. And it only came about after intense negotiations between the government, the television companies and the National Football Association.
We've suffered not having football, which is something Argentines love and live for. There's no league in the world that doesn't have Argentine players, which is very satisfying for us. But the biggest joy is that today we can resume playing football.
They've created a new tournament, 6 groups of 4 First Division teams. 12 go through to a second round and form a complex format. Winners will emerge to compete in next year's South American Club Championships. Some fans are scratching their heads, but happy that at least the football's back.
I survived. I watched a lot of international football, but I missed our national teams. So I'm obviously very glad that it's back.
I'm used to watching a lot of football, but thanks to social media and videos, I've managed to make it through.
Sport, along with much else, was suspended in March. Argentina has suffered 30,000 deaths from the pandemic and more than 1 million people have been infected. Football here is an intrinsic part of daily life and its absence has been strongly felt. But now it's back with all its hopes, expectations and disappointments. An essential distraction in troubled times. The Argentine economy was already in a bad way before the virus struck, and football clubs haven't escaped the devastation that's followed.
Argentina's in a tough way at the moment with the pandemic. The numbers keep going up. They're showing no signs of slowing. But after 7 months, the clubs are pretty much in a terrible state. They're bleeding money. They haven't been receiving television money because obviously they haven't been playing.
But now they will, and where there's football, there's magic. And no one personifies that better than Diego Maradona, manager of Gimnasia Esgrima, who played the first game of the new season, on the day the number 10 celebrates his 60th birthday.
For all his flaws, for all the misadventures he's been involved in over the years, he remains an idol. He's a guy that when he speaks, everyone listens, everyone kind of repeats and magnifies what he's saying, and that just goes to show that I think like Diego Maradona, there is absolutely no one else in this world.
Some may say there are more important things to worry about right now, but here football is a powerful symbol of what's been lost and what they hope to retrieve. Daniel Schweimer, Al Jazeera, Buenos Aires.
The Portland Timbers have booked their place in Major League Soccer's playoffs. They beat the Western Conference's rock-bottom side, the LA Galaxy, 5-2 on Thursday. This is the 4th straight season that the Timbers have made the postseason. They're looking for their second MLS title, having been champions back in 2015.
That's polo.
Now there's some good news for fans in Japan that bought tickets for the Tokyo Olympics. They can now get their money back if they don't want to attend the rescheduled games in 2021. Well, the ruling, however, does not apply to holders from outside the country. Organizers have sold over 5 million tickets for the Olympics and Paralympics domestically. It's still not clear, however, whether fans will actually be able to attend events due to the ongoing pandemic.
Due to the postponement of the games, for those who unfortunately find it difficult to attend, we will refund the ticket to the customer who wants to refund the ticket. Here on out, if the organizing committee cannot provide the opportunity to spectate the games due to the impact of COVID-19, we will plan to refund the tickets separately.
Justin Langer believes his side, Australia, have the players to beat India, who'll be touring the country starting next month. The teams will initially face off in 3 ODIs and 3 T20s. Langer won't, however, be able to prepare with a full squad, though. With the IPL wrapping up on November 10th, a number of his players will have to quarantine for 2 weeks upon their arrival back home. with the first ODI happening on November 27th. All the sides will also contest a 4-match test series. And finally, many of the world's top surfers have been preparing to take part in one of the toughest competitions on the Surf League calendar. Hundreds gathered off the coast of Portugal to watch the best of the best try and tame some gigantic waves. A lot of them, though, had a lot of trouble. The famous surfing hotspot often generates record-breaking swells, and there were also some serious wipeouts on Thursday. The Nazare Challenge begins November the 2nd. And that is all your sport for now. More later.
Oh, amazing pictures. That's it for the NewsHour. I'll see you in a couple of minutes with another bulletin.